My stepmom kept joking that I was faking my diabetes for attention until the paramedics asked why my insulin kept disappearing. The diagnosis came when I was 14, right after I collapsed during basketball practice and woke up in the hospital with an IV in my arm and my dad crying next to my bed. Type 1 diabetes, the endocrinologist Dr. Patel explained, an autoimmune disease where my pancreas stopped producing insulin. She showed us how to use the glucose meter, how to calculate carbohydrates, how to inject insulin before meals and at bedtime. Dad took notes on everything while I sat there trying to process that my life had just changed forever. Dr. Patel said with proper management, I could live a completely normal life, but missing insulin doses or miscalculating dosages could result in diabetic ketoacidosis, seizures, coma, or death. She made me repeat back the symptoms of low blood sugar so she knew I understood: shakiness, confusion, sweating, rapid heartbeat, loss of consciousness. Dad scheduled follow-up appointments, and we left the hospital with a bag full of supplies and prescriptions that cost more than our monthly grocery bill even with insurance. Mom had died 2 years earlier from cancer, and it had just been Dad and me figuring out how to live without her. We'd developed routines and inside jokes, and a way of being together that felt safe even though we were both still broken. Then 6 months after my diagnosis, Dad started dating someone from his office named Vivian. She was 42, 8 years younger than Dad, with perfect hair and a laugh that sounded performative. She worked in accounting and wore expensive jewelry and talked about her previous marriage to a doctor like it proved she belonged in a certain social class. Dad seemed happy around her, lighter somehow, and I wanted him to be happy even though I felt uncomfortable every time she came over. Vivian would arrive with wine and fancy cheese and act interested in my school projects, but her questions felt rehearsed and her smile never reached her eyes when she looked at me. They got married 11 months after they started dating, a small ceremony at City Hall with just a few witnesses. Vivian moved into our house the following week with a dozen suitcases and boxes of decorative items that she immediately scattered throughout rooms that had been ours. She replaced Mom's photos on the mantle with abstract art pieces. She threw away the coffee mugs Mom had collected from different vacations. She rearranged the kitchen completely so I couldn't find anything anymore. Dad seemed oblivious to how she was erasing Mom from our home, too focused on his new marriage to notice what his son was losing. Within a month, our house felt like a stranger's place where I was just staying temporarily. Vivian dominated conversations at dinner, talking about her day and her opinions and her plans for remodeling the bathroom. When I tried to share something about school or basketball, she'd listen for maybe 30 seconds before redirecting the conversation back to herself. The insulin issues started small about 3 months after Vivian moved in. I kept my supplies in a specific drawer in my bathroom, organized exactly how I needed them. One morning, I went to get my insulin pen before breakfast and found it moved to the medicine cabinet. I asked Dad if he'd been in my bathroom, and he said no, looking confused. I asked Vivian, and she laughed, saying she'd been organizing and thought the insulin should be with other medications. I explained that I kept it in the drawer because it needed to stay at a specific temperature range, and I needed to access it quickly. She rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic about placement. The next week, my backup insulin vials were moved to the kitchen refrigerator behind leftovers and condiments. Vivian said she was trying to help by keeping all refrigerated items in one place. I told her those vials cost $400 each and needed to be easily accessible, not buried behind last night's takeout. The comments started around the same time. At dinner one evening, I tested my blood sugar before eating, and Vivian watched me prick my finger and check the meter. She made a face and said it was disgusting to do that at the table. Dad defended me, explaining that I needed to test before every meal to calculate my insulin dose. Vivian sighed dramatically and said when her nephew had diabetes, he just went to the bathroom to do all that. I explained that type 1 required testing immediately before eating, not 10 minutes earlier, because blood sugar could change rapidly. She waved her hand dismissively and said I was making it more complicated than it needed to be. The next morning at breakfast, she made a comment about how much attention my diabetes required. She said her nephew managed his diabetes without making such a production of it. Dad looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. I focused on my eggs and ignored her. 2 weeks later, I came home from school and found my insulin pens in the trash. The actual trash, thrown away with coffee grounds and banana peels. I dug them out frantically, checking if they were damaged. Vivian walked into the kitchen and said she'd been cleaning out expired medications. I held up the pens, showing her the expiration date was 8 months away. She shrugged and said she must have grabbed the wrong items. Dad came home and I showed him what happened, explained that those pens cost hundreds of dollars and throwing them away could have killed me if I hadn't found them. He talked to Vivian privately and she apologized at dinner, saying she'd been careless and it wouldn't happen again. Her apology sounded hollow and rehearsed, like she was reading lines from a script. Dad seemed satisfied that she'd apologized and wanted to move on. I didn't trust her anymore, but had no way to prove she'd done it deliberately. The jokes started the following month at a family dinner with Dad's brother and his wife. Vivian told everyone a story about how I'd panicked over my insulin being moved, making it sound like I'd overreacted to a minor inconvenience. She said with a laugh that I was so dramatic about my diabetes, like I wanted everyone to pay attention to me constantly. Dad's brother chuckled uncomfortably, and Dad told Vivian that wasn't funny. She waved him off, saying she was just teasing, that I needed to learn to laugh at myself. I sat there feeling my face burn with humiliation, while she continued making light of my medical condition in front of family. After they left, I told Dad that what Vivian said wasn't okay. He sighed and said she didn't mean any harm, that she was still adjusting to having a teenager with medical needs. He asked me to be patient with her. My next endocrinologist appointment happened 3 weeks later, and Dr. Patel noticed my blood sugar logs were erratic. She asked if I was taking my insulin consistently, and I said yes, but my numbers had been unpredictable lately. She questioned whether I was measuring carbohydrates accurately or if I was going through growth spurts that affected my dosing needs. I didn't tell her about the moved insulin or the trash incident, because I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding paranoid. She adjusted my dosing schedule and told me to be more vigilant about testing frequently. On the drive home, Vivian, who'd come with Dad to the appointment, made a comment about the doctor seeming concerned about my compliance. She said maybe the erratic numbers meant I wasn't being as careful as I claimed. Dad defended me, saying I was extremely responsible about my diabetes management. Vivian smiled sweetly and said, of course, she wasn't criticizing, just making an observation. The insulin started disappearing completely a month later. I'd have 6 pens in my drawer, and the next day there'd be 4, then 3, then 1. I started keeping detailed counts and taking photos of my supply each morning. When 2 pens vanished overnight, I showed Dad the photos, proving I wasn't miscounting. He confronted Vivian and she acted shocked, suggesting maybe I was hiding them myself to make her look bad. Dad asked why I would do that, and she said teenagers did strange things for attention, especially teenagers who'd lost a parent and felt displaced by a new step-parent. The accusation was so twisted and manipulative that I couldn't even formulate a response. Dad looked between us uncertainly, wanting to believe me but clearly affected by her suggestion. I went to my room and locked the door, feeling like I was going crazy. I started keeping my insulin in a locked box in my closet, with the only key on my keychain. For 2 weeks, nothing went missing. Then one afternoon, I came home from school to find the locked box open and empty on my bed. The lock had been forced with something, metal scratches visible around the mechanism. Every single insulin pen was gone. I had one backup vial in the kitchen refrigerator for emergencies, and when I checked, it was gone too. I was supposed to take insulin before dinner in 3 hours, and had nothing. I called Dad at work panicking, and he left immediately. Vivian was home, had been home all day, and claimed she knew nothing about it. She suggested I'd lost my key and someone must have broken in. Dad called the police to file a report, but nothing else in the house was missing. No signs of forced entry, no stolen valuables, just my insulin. Every dose. The police officer taking the report asked specific questions about who had access to the house. Dad and Vivian and me. That was it. The officer looked at Vivian for a long moment and asked if there were any family conflicts happening. Vivian laughed and said of course not. We were working on blending our family and sometimes that had challenges. The officer wrote down his observations and said unfortunately, without evidence of who took the insulin, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested we install a camera in my room for future incidents. After he left, I had to go to the emergency pharmacy for insulin replacement, which cost $600 out of pocket because insurance had already covered my monthly supply. Dad paid, but I could see the financial stress on his face. Vivian acted sympathetic and concerned, the perfect stepmother worried about her troubled stepson. I installed a camera in my room myself, a small one that recorded to a memory card and had motion detection. I didn't tell anyone about it. 3 days later, the camera caught Vivian entering my room at 2 in the afternoon while I was at school and Dad was at work. The footage showed her going straight to my closet, finding the new lockbox I'd purchased, and spending 15 minutes working on the lock with tools she'd brought. She finally got it open, removed 4 insulin pens, and left. The entire thing was captured in clear video with timestamps. I showed Dad that evening and his face went pale watching the footage. He confronted Vivian immediately, and she denied it was her, said the video was unclear, said I must have edited it somehow. Dad rewound and played it 3 times. Her face was clearly visible. Her actions were deliberate and calculated. Dad told Vivian she needed to leave the house until they figured this out. She started crying, saying he was choosing his son over his wife, that I'd been poisoning him against her since day one. She claimed I resented her for replacing my mother and was manufacturing this entire situation to break up their marriage. Dad's voice got hard in a way I'd never heard before. He said she'd been stealing life-saving medication from a minor and that was abuse, possibly criminal. Vivian switched tactics and said she was just trying to teach me responsibility, that I was too dependent on my diabetes as an identity and needed to learn to manage without being so dramatic about it. The statement was so absurd and dangerous that Dad just stared at her. He told her to pack a bag and stay somewhere else while he consulted a lawyer. She left screaming about how ungrateful I was and how she'd sacrificed everything to be part of our family. That night, I had my first serious hypoglycemic episode in months. My blood sugar dropped to 42, and I woke up at 3 in the morning shaking violently, soaked in sweat, my heart racing so fast I thought it would explode. I managed to get to the kitchen and drink juice, but my hands were shaking so badly, I spilled half of it. Dad found me sitting on the kitchen floor, waiting for my blood sugar to rise. He sat down next to me and cried, really cried, saying he was sorry for not believing me sooner. Sorry for bringing Vivian into our lives. Sorry for not protecting me. I told him it wasn't his fault. He said it was absolutely his fault, because he was the parent and should have seen what was happening. We sat on that kitchen floor until my blood sugar stabilized and the sun started coming up. Vivian came back 2 days later while Dad was at work, and I was homesick from school. She let herself in with her key and found me in the living room. She said she wanted to talk, that we needed to work this out as a family. I told her I had nothing to say to her, and she needed to leave. She sat down on the couch and started talking about how hard it had been for her adjusting to instant motherhood, how she'd felt shut out of the relationship Dad and I had, how my diabetes had dominated all the attention in the household. She said she'd only been trying to show me I was stronger than I thought, that I didn't need to rely on medical interventions so heavily. The words coming out of her mouth were so disconnected from reality that I just stared at her. I asked if she understood that type 1 diabetes meant my body produced no insulin, and without synthetic insulin, I would die. She waved that away, saying doctors exaggerated to sell medication. I recorded her entire speech on my phone without her knowing. She talked for 20 minutes about how pharmaceutical companies created dependence, how natural remedies could manage diabetes, how I needed to try harder to heal my body instead of relying on insulin. She said she'd been researching alternative treatments and found testimonials from people who'd cured their diabetes through diet and positive thinking. I asked her if she'd been taking my insulin to force me into trying her alternative treatments. She hesitated, and then said she'd been gradually reducing my access to see if my body would adjust and start producing insulin naturally. The admission was captured clearly on the recording. She'd been deliberately stealing life-saving medication based on internet conspiracy theories about pharmaceutical companies. I told her to leave, and she refused until I promised to talk to Dad about reconciliation. I called Dad, and he came home immediately, telling Vivian to get out before he called the police. Dad filed for divorce the next day and got an emergency restraining order based on the video evidence and the recorded confession. The family court judge granted it immediately, prohibiting Vivian from coming within 500 feet of our house or contacting me in any way. Dad's lawyer said we could potentially file criminal charges for child endangerment and theft. I wanted to move forward with charges, but Dad was hesitant, worried about the public nature of a trial and what it would do to our privacy. His lawyer explained that without criminal consequences, Vivian would likely do this to someone else. That convinced Dad. We filed a police report with all our evidence, and the detective assigned to the case said it was one of the clearest examples of medical abuse she'd seen. The charges were filed 3 weeks later: child endangerment, theft, and unlawful interference with medical treatment. Vivian hired an expensive lawyer who immediately tried to get the charges dismissed, arguing that as my stepmother, she'd been trying to help me become less dependent on medication. The prosecutor shut that down by presenting Dr. Patel's testimony about type 1 diabetes being incurable and insulin being non-negotiable for survival. Vivian's lawyer shifted strategies and painted her as a confused woman who'd made mistakes while trying to blend a family. The prosecutor presented the camera footage and the recorded confession where Vivian admitted to deliberately reducing my insulin access. The preliminary hearing judge found probable cause for all charges and scheduled a trial. Dad's brother called and said we should drop the charges, that Vivian was family, and family didn't send each other to prison. Dad asked if he'd send his own kids to live with someone who was stealing their medication. His brother said that was different, and Dad told him it wasn't different at all. Dad's brother accused him of overreacting and choosing me over family unity. Dad said he was choosing his son's life over protecting an abuser and hung up. We didn't hear from that part of the family again for months. Other relatives called with similar messages about forgiveness and moving on and not making this a legal matter. Dad blocked numbers and told me we were done with anyone who valued appearances over my safety. The trial was scheduled for 4 months out. In the meantime, I had to testify at a deposition where Vivian's lawyer asked me aggressive questions trying to prove I'd been non-compliant with my diabetes management. He asked if I ever forgot doses or miscalculated carbs or ate without testing first. I answered honestly that yes, sometimes I made mistakes because I was human and managing diabetes was complicated. He tried to use those admissions to suggest my erratic blood sugar logs were due to my own negligence, not Vivian's interference. The prosecutor objected repeatedly and reminded everyone that even if I'd occasionally made errors, that didn't give Vivian the right to steal my medication. The deposition lasted 3 hours, and I left feeling like I'd been put on trial for having a chronic illness. My blood sugar control improved dramatically once Vivian was out of the house. My A1C dropped from 8.2 to 6.9 in 3 months. Dr. Patel said the improvement was remarkable and asked what had changed. I told her about Vivian and the stolen insulin and the criminal case. She looked horrified and said she should have picked up on the signs during my previous appointments. She asked permission to document everything in my medical file and potentially testify if needed. I agreed, and she wrote a detailed report about how my erratic blood sugar patterns coincided exactly with Vivian living in our house and resolved immediately after she left. The report became key evidence for the prosecution. School became difficult because word spread about the trial. Some kids were supportive, but others made jokes about my stepmom trying to kill me. The school counselor called me in for weekly check-ins to make sure I was coping emotionally. I told her I was fine, but really I wasn't sleeping well and couldn't focus in class. My basketball coach noticed my performance had declined and asked what was going on. I gave him a brief explanation, and he said I could take time off if needed. I told him basketball was the only place I felt normal anymore, and he understood. He made sure the team knew not to bring it up around me. Vivian's lawyer contacted the prosecutor with a plea deal offer. Vivian would plead guilty to misdemeanor child endangerment in exchange for probation and no jail time. The prosecutor asked how I felt about that. I said it wasn't enough, that she'd deliberately put my life at risk repeatedly over months, and a misdemeanor with probation felt like no consequences at all. The prosecutor agreed and rejected the offer. Vivian's lawyer came back with another offer. Guilty plea to felony child endangerment with 2 years suspended sentence and 5 years probation. Still no jail time. Dad and I talked about whether to accept it. Part of me wanted to see her actually punished with prison time. Another part of me was exhausted and wanted this over. Dad said the decision was mine. I told the prosecutor we'd accept the plea deal only if it included Vivian admitting in open court exactly what she'd done and why. The plea hearing happened on a Thursday morning in criminal court. Vivian stood before the judge in a conservative suit, looking nothing like the woman who'd lived in our house. Her lawyer read the terms of the plea agreement, and the judge asked Vivian if she understood she was pleading guilty to felony child endangerment. Vivian said yes in a quiet voice. The judge asked her to explain in her own words what she'd done. Vivian started talking about family dynamics and adjustment challenges, and the judge cut her off. She told Vivian to specifically describe her actions regarding my insulin. Vivian admitted she'd removed insulin from my possession multiple times over several months. The judge asked why. Vivian said she'd believed I was exaggerating my medical needs and wanted to prove I could manage without so much medication. The judge's face hardened, and she asked if Vivian understood that type 1 diabetes required insulin to survive. Vivian nodded. The judge accepted the guilty plea but added conditions beyond what the plea deal specified. Vivian was prohibited from working in any healthcare, childcare, or elder care capacity. She had to complete 200 hours of community service at a diabetes education center where she'd learn what she'd failed to understand before endangering a child. She had to pay restitution covering all my medical expenses related to her interference, including emergency pharmacy visits and extra doctor appointments. The judge said if Vivian violated any terms of her probation or came near me again, she'd face the original charges and significant prison time. Vivian agreed to everything and was led out of the courtroom by her lawyer. Dad squeezed my shoulder, and I felt something release in my chest that had been tight for months. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Vivian got nothing from the marriage because of the criminal conviction and the prenuptial agreement Dad had insisted on before they married. She moved to another state and we never heard from her directly again. Dad threw away everything she'd left behind, and we slowly started making the house feel like ours again. He put Mom's photos back on the mantle. We bought new coffee mugs together. He let me choose new paint colors for the living room. We developed new routines that felt safe and sustainable for just the two of us. 3 months after the plea deal, I got a call from a detective in another state asking about Vivian. Apparently, she'd moved in with an older man who had Parkinson's disease, and his adult daughter had noticed his medication going missing. The daughter had found my case through an internet search and contacted police. They were building a case against Vivian for financial exploitation and medical neglect. The detective asked if I'd be willing to provide testimony about her pattern of behavior. I said yes without hesitation. Dad's lawyer coordinated with the detective, and I gave a deposition describing everything Vivian had done. The other state filed charges, and Vivian's probation was revoked for engaging in prohibited behavior. She ended up serving 18 months in prison after all. My senior year of high school, I joined a diabetes advocacy group that worked to educate people about type 1 and push for better insurance coverage of supplies. I spoke at a few events about my experience, not naming Vivian specifically, but talking about how dangerous it was when people minimized or dismissed chronic illness management. Several other teens approached me afterward with their own stories of family members who didn't take their medical needs seriously. One girl's grandmother kept feeding her foods she was allergic to, insisting allergies were psychosomatic. Another guy's stepfather refused to let him take his asthma medication, saying he needed to toughen up. The commonality was terrifying. Adults in positions of authority wielding medical neglect as a form of control. I got accepted to college with a pre-med focus and decided I wanted to become an endocrinologist. Dr. Patel wrote one of my recommendation letters and mentioned in it that I'd overcome significant adversity related to my diagnosis. Dad helped me move into the dorms and made sure I had a mini fridge for insulin storage and a safe for backup supplies. He called every day the first week to make sure I was managing okay. I was managing better than okay. For the first time since my diagnosis, I had complete control over my own medical care without someone interfering. Dad started dating again during my sophomore year of college. He was very cautious, and introduced me to his girlfriend Maureen after they'd been seeing each other for 6 months. She was a librarian, kind and quiet, with grown kids of her own. The first time she saw me test my blood sugar before a meal, she asked if there was anything she should know about helping if I had an emergency. Dad showed her where I kept my glucagon kit, and she listened carefully to his instructions. She never made a single comment about my diabetes being inconvenient or attention-seeking. She treated it like what it was, a medical condition I managed daily without drama. The diabetes advocacy group I joined in high school asked me to speak at their annual conference during my junior year of college. I agreed and wrote a speech about medical abuse and the warning signs that someone might be interfering with a patient's treatment. I talked about missing medications, dismissive comments, accusations of exaggeration, and isolation from medical providers. The speech was scheduled for 20 minutes, but I spoke for 35, and no one stopped me. Afterward, a dozen people approached with their own stories or thanked me for naming something they'd experienced but couldn't articulate. A social worker asked permission to use portions of my speech in training materials for Child Protective Services. I said yes, and felt like maybe Vivian's abuse had at least resulted in something protective for others. Dad married Maureen the summer after I graduated college. It was a small ceremony in their backyard with close friends and family. Maureen's daughter was the maid of honor, and I was Dad's best man. During his vows, Dad mentioned that the best part of his life was being my father and finding someone who understood that his son would always be his priority. Maureen smiled and nodded, and I believed she meant it. At the reception, she made sure there were low-sugar options available and pointed them out to me without making a production of it. That small gesture of understanding felt like everything. I started medical school the following fall and rotated through different specialties during my third year. The endocrinology rotation felt like coming home. I worked with patients managing diabetes, thyroid disorders, and hormonal imbalances. I saw how much difference it made when doctors listened and believed patients about their symptoms and challenges. I witnessed the damage caused when medical professionals dismissed concerns or minimized struggles. One attending physician was brilliant clinically, but terrible at patient communication, talking over people and ignoring their questions. I made a note to myself never to practice medicine that way. During my residency, I encountered a teenage patient whose blood sugar logs looked familiar. Erratic patterns, unexplained lows and highs, poor control despite apparent compliance. I asked questions beyond the standard protocol. Who had access to her insulin? Had any gone missing? Did anyone make comments about her being dramatic or seeking attention? The girl started crying and said her stepfather kept moving her insulin and telling her mother she was making up problems for attention. I documented everything, contacted social services, and made sure she left the hospital with a safety plan and resources. Her mother called me 3 weeks later to say they'd gotten a restraining order and filed for divorce. She thanked me for asking the right questions when other doctors had just adjusted dosages. That case reminded me why Vivian's abuse mattered beyond my own experience. Medical neglect was insidious because it came wrapped in concern or dismissal or claims of helping. It was hard to prove and easy to hide behind closed doors. Victims often didn't realize they were being abused because the perpetrator framed their actions as care or tough love. Speaking about my experience gave others language to identify their own situations. That felt like purpose emerging from trauma. 10 years after Vivian's guilty plea, I was an attending endocrinologist at a teaching hospital with a focus on adolescent diabetes care. I published papers about recognizing medical abuse in pediatric chronic illness management. I trained residents to ask screening questions about home safety and medication access. I worked with social services to develop better protocols for investigating suspected medical neglect. Dad came to my hospital grand rounds presentation about diabetes and family dynamics. Afterward, he told me he was proud of how I'd transformed something terrible into protection for others. Maureen died suddenly from a stroke when I was 32. Dad was devastated, and I took leave from work to stay with him for 2 weeks. We sat together in the house they'd shared, and he talked about how grateful he was for the 10 years they'd had. He said Maureen had helped him heal from the guilt he carried about Vivian and what happened to me. I told him he'd done his best once he understood the truth and had protected me fiercely afterward. He said that would never feel like enough, but appreciated me saying it. We went through old photos and found pictures from my high school graduation and college move-in and my medical school white coat ceremony. Maureen was in all of them, smiling in the background, supporting quietly without needing attention. I got married at 34 to another physician I'd met during residency. Rachel was an emergency medicine doctor who understood irregular schedules and medical crises. On our wedding day, Dad gave a toast about how proud he was watching me build a life defined by caring for others, rather than being limited by what I'd survived. He mentioned that some people tried to diminish us, but we got to choose whether that diminishment defined our story. I thought about Vivian briefly, wondered where she was, and if she'd ever understood the magnitude of what she'd done. Then I looked at Rachel and Dad and my friends and colleagues filling the reception hall and decided it didn't matter. She'd failed to break me, and that was the only outcome that counted. Rachel and I had twin daughters 3 years later. They were healthy and perfect and kept us exhausted in the best way. When they were 6 months old, I took them to visit Dad and found him crying while holding them both. He said he'd been thinking about how close he'd come to losing me during those months Vivian was stealing my insulin, how different everything would be if she'd succeeded in causing a fatal hypoglycemic episode. I told him I was still here, and we had this beautiful life, because he'd ultimately chosen to protect me over protecting his marriage. That decision had saved everything that came after. My daughters are 5 now, and starting to ask questions about my diabetes. They've seen me test my blood sugar and inject insulin their whole lives. Rachel and I explain it simply. Dad's body doesn't make something it needs, so he has to add it with medicine. They accept this the way they accept that some people wear glasses or use wheelchairs. Just a variation in how bodies work. I'm teaching them early that everyone has things that make them different, and those differences require accommodation, not judgment. They're learning to notice when someone needs help and offer it without making that person feel diminished. Last month, I gave a lecture at a medical conference about long-term outcomes for diabetes patients who experienced medical abuse during adolescence. The research showed higher rates of anxiety, depression, and poor disease management in adulthood. But it also showed that patients who received validation and support after the abuse often became powerful advocates for others. I presented my own story as a case study with permission from the ethics board. After the lecture, a young doctor approached and said his stepmother had done something similar with his epilepsy medication when he was 15. He'd never told anyone because he thought no one would believe him. He thanked me for speaking publicly and giving him permission to name what had happened to him. These moments happen regularly now. Someone hears my story and recognizes their own. A patient mentions offhand that their partner hides their medication. A colleague remembers a suspicious case from years ago and wonders if they missed signs of abuse. Each conversation plants seeds of awareness that might protect someone else. I think about all the people Vivian hurt, or could have hurt, if she hadn't been stopped. The man with Parkinson's whose daughter intervened. The hypothetical future victims who never existed because she had a criminal record. My daughters who have a father because that criminal record came with consequences. Dad is 70 now, retired and healthy and present for every milestone in his granddaughters' lives. We have dinner together every Sunday and he plays endless games with the twins. They adore him completely, and he spoils them appropriately. Sometimes I watch him with them and see shadows cross his face. Brief moments where I know he's remembering those years with Vivian and how close we came to a different ending. Then, one of the girls will demand his attention, and the shadow passes. We're here. We survived. That's what matters most. Vivian sent a letter to my hospital 5 years ago. The administration forwarded it to me with a note that I wasn't required to read it. I kept it sealed for 2 months before finally opening it. She'd written about recovery and taking responsibility and understanding now what she'd failed to understand then. She said she'd completed therapy and worked with diabetes educators and recognized the magnitude of her actions. She asked for nothing except that I know she was sorry. I read it twice and then filed it away. Her apology didn't change what happened, but also didn't make things worse. It existed separate from my healing, neither required nor harmful. I think about Vivian sometimes when I'm training residents or speaking at conferences or treating patients who've experienced medical trauma. I think about how she truly believed she was helping, that pharmaceutical companies were the enemy, that I needed toughening up rather than life-saving medication. The certainty of her wrongness is staggering in retrospect. She nearly killed me while convinced she was teaching me resilience. That disconnection between intent and impact is what makes medical abuse so dangerous. Perpetrators often genuinely believe their harmful actions are justified or even beneficial. Education and consequences are the only tools we have to interrupt that belief system before it destroys lives. My daughters will grow up in a house where medical needs are respected without question, where asking for help is strength rather than weakness, where their body's requirements are accommodated rather than dismissed. They'll know their grandfather fought to protect their father when someone tried to take away his medicine. They'll understand that love means believing people about their pain and their needs. They'll learn that some fights are worth having even when they fracture families, because safety matters more than false peace. These lessons feel like the opposite of everything Vivian represented, and teaching them to my daughters feels like the final victory over what she tried to do to me. 23 years after my diagnosis, I run a clinic specifically for young adults with type 1 diabetes transitioning from pediatric to adult care. We address not just medical management, but also how to advocate for themselves with employers, partners, and families. We screen for medication insecurity and home safety. We connect patients with resources if they're experiencing any form of medical abuse or neglect. The clinic exists because I know what it's like when the people who should protect you become the threat. Every patient who walks through our doors gets believed, supported, and equipped with tools to protect themselves. That's the legacy I've built from the wreckage Vivian left behind.